Hi everyone. Let me first of all take a few seconds to thank the team of the PSA Early Career Network for putting this panel together and give us the opportunity to discuss important topics about Latin America in this first ever online annual conference. Today, I'm going to share with you part of my postdoctoral research agenda with a paper I've prepared for this panel. The paper is entitled Faced by Media Capture Trends in Increasingly Digitalized Communication Systems, the Case of Environmental and LGBTI+ Organizations in Chile. I normally start my presentations by mapping out upfront my main argument and empirical contributions, exploring the themes of media capture contestation, digital communications and the non-profit sector in Chile. This paper aims to examine how local non-profit organizations appropriate of new technologies with the purpose of addressing and contesting news media capture. This inquiry derives from a bargaining literature that has been preoccupied with how covert ties between political and economic elites have the news media captured through editorial influence and financial pressures. Now, a branch of this scholarship has also looked into forms of contestation to media capture, documenting stands carried out by philanthropists for legal reform in Europe and the US. This is clearly a very direct form of media capture contestation, so questions remain regarding less direct challenges and what is happening in other latitudes of the world. My research addresses this gap in particular with the case of environmental and LGBTI+ organizations. It finds that most of these organizations claim to be affected by invisibility and/or misrepresentation in the news media, due to patterns of media capture related with businesses, interests, and the conservative values of political elites. It also finds that a large number of these groups attempt to indirectly defy this media capture by means of an appropriation of digital platforms. Most of these attempts are in a way an insider effort, meaning that social media and blogs are used to entice the attention of journalists and manage to pass the media gatekeepers. More interestingly, a few other attempts stand as an outsider effort to bypass the news media and connect goals and audiences without this type of visibility. It is normally in this second practice that we can find an overt questioning of the ownership and interests of the news media in Chile. I'll show you in more detail that the argument I've just presented shows us how media capture contestation in a digital environment can take more subtle or indirect forms, and what this means to the literature. Many of you will notice that the use of digital technology to make the news, or to bypass media gatekeepers, isn't a novelty at all, but it hasn't been connected effectively with the concept of media capture so far, and this is the main contribution of this paper. Media capture is a relatively recent conceptual development in the field of political communication, which illustrates how the news media are controlled by intertwined political and economic interests, often in covert and intricate ways. The concept of media capture is closely related to the idea of regulatory capture, a situation in which non-governmental actors tasked with scrutinizing the corporate sector, we can say, or we can name here something like playing a watchdog role, are captured by the very businesses they oversee. When the news media are captured in this sort of circular way, the main outcome is the production of biased news stories that privilege the economic profits and political power of the elites over citizen issues. As a conceptual framework, media capture has plenty of applications in today's communication landscapes. It gives a nuanced view of how the news production is influenced by for-profit interests, and therefore it's more effective than prior views on media control, such as the propaganda model. The media capture approach is instead much more suited to examine the media systems of the Global South, where media capture tends to be far more sophisticated than direct censorship and overt government control of the media, which is, by the way, the most familiar way we have to understand this topic. First, we can find enormous levels of economic concentration in developing countries. Some studies have shown that high concentration makes the occurrence of media capture practices more likely. There are also lasting legacies of previous authoritarian regimes across the Global South, which have been institutionalized in many processes of democratic reform. Patronage and clientelism have become the main mechanism of media capture in transitional political systems. So, for example, journalists receive nuanced signals from colluded government officers and corporations through advertising, subsidies, and personal ties. Latin America is a region characterized by problematic practices of clientelism, in most cases derived from the recent process of transition to democracy experienced by various countries, particularly in the Southern Cone. And since there has been little research in this region, in the discipline of media studies, there are good reasons to examine how media capture works in the context of Latin America. The literature media capture has been moving fast in the last years, making more progress in looking at different aspects of the phenomenon. In these explorations, scholars have shifted the focus from the origins to the effects of media capture. The most studied and visible effect of media capture is that basically the news media cannot fully exercise their informative role. As there is very restricted space for citizen issues in the news, we might not get a fair representation of our pluralist society in these pages and these transmissions. In this regard, there is a vast literature on the difficulties faced by civil society to access fair representation in the news media. Furthermore, socioeconomic inequalities only get worsened when the news media are used by the elites to increase their revenues, especially if minorities and dissenting ideas get ignored. The focus on the effects of media capture, as I've just described it, has made it possible to explore diverse forms of civil contestation of this process. Among these challenges, the most documented in the literature have been the publicity stunts carried out by northern non-profit organizations to push for reform in their respective national media systems. All these challenges can be considered quite direct, as they try to regulate the ways in which the media are funded to prevent the occurrence of capture practices. But here we need to assume that there are other forms of media capture contestation that are less direct and more affordable for most citizens. We cannot ignore the fact that only a few have the capacity to intervene in policy debates. I add to this the growing concern among media students regarding the digital media systems in which capture unfolds today. In fact, digitalization has been scarcely taken into consideration in these studies. For all these reasons, there is an opportunity to unveil the indirect ways in which civil society groups contest media capture trends in Latin America, especially in relation to the unavoidable use of new communication technologies today. In this regard, other relevant literatures have set some precedents. The most important here is the study of activist digital startups to overcome lack of media coverage. Once identified an important gap in relation to indirect forms of media capture contestation among civil society organizations and the importance of looking at this process in Latin America, I've decided to look into how non-profit organizations appropriate of new communication technologies or digital media to contest media capture. I did so by examining data on different traditional, digital, and hybrid media practices of 41 contemporary environmental and LGBTI+ organizations based in Chile. I carried out two fieldwork processes in the central area of Chile between 2016 and 2017, which allowed me to interview various activists involved in these organizations and access relevant documents and websites. When these organizations were curious about the nature of the relationship with the news media, for the most part, they have identified intrinsic capture trends in their national media system. The majority experienced this capture in the form of gatekeeping and information blocking of their actions and ideas, even if these actions were very visible in the public space. But also a few other organizations recognize that the news space is restrictive, but without associating this restriction with capture. These groups view these limitations as part of how the market and newsrooms work, which confirms their acceptance that the news media are for-profit corporations. The organizations that represent this view are in fact closely tied to the country's elites, having known businessmen and intellectuals in their boards. What's interesting in this regard is that these ties translate into more and better media coverage for them. The groups who identify media capture as a real thing in Chile identify two main actors pulling the strings of the media. On the one hand, they have identified political elites of the country who defend the status quo and a conservative agenda that affects LGBTI+ organizations the most. These elites have a strong influence over the news agenda and prevent dissident issues to be discussed in this space. On the other hand, environmental organizations have identified economic interests as a major source of media capture, who use financial pressures such as advertising to privilege the coverage of their brands and expansion plans and expect the marginalization of themes that pose a threat to their businesses. These economic interests can go as far as being the same ones that own important media conglomerates, alongside mining, energy, and retail projects. This becomes quite problematic for challenging actors who are embedded in a highly concentrated media system. In this slide, you can see some quotes from the interviews, which illustrate better how the sampled organizations identify media capture with specific interests and agendas. As I told you at the beginning of this video presentation, the effects of media capture on them range from invisibilization or marginalization to misrepresentation or distortion, which is potentially the most harmful of them all. For example, some groups have mentioned that journalists often talk with them about their issues, but then, when the report is finally published or broadcasted, other sources appear as representing these views instead. In other occasions, environmental organizations are associated with street violence, while LGBTI+ groups are depicted as glamorous or depraved, which again has harmful consequences for their political objectives. Let me now discuss what happens with media contestation. The data show that the sample organizations use available digital media in two different ways. The most common one, found in the overwhelming majority of them, has to do with searching for ways to survive the invisibilization associated with media capture. Even though these actors recognize the existence and negative consequences of media capture, they still try to pass the media filter. This is because they really need this level of visibility for their goals, no matter how restrictive. As a result of this need, social networking sites, blog posts, and opinion pieces in online-only news outlets are used to make it to the news. This often works for them when they manage to turn certain discussions into trending topics that journalists cannot ignore. I need to stop here and clarify that in most cases this is a non-canonical newsmaking strategy that is used complementarily and not in replacement of more conventional tactics such as professionalized media service, disruptive events, and paid advertising. Another less common use of social media aims to circumvent the news media as much as possible. These actors have decided to stop playing the game of the news media and therefore they use their digital resources as if they were their own media outlets, and where they can generate and disseminate relevant content. In these spaces of communication that they often consider free from capture, it's possible to find some ideas that discuss and stand against news media capture. For example, these alternative media outlets help them denounce how the news media are disinforming people about certain issues and deny what the media say. Finally, it's important to highlight here that among these attitudes we can also find a few who try to avoid social media corporations as well, because they believe these platforms are co-opted by the same interests that control the news media. In conclusion, the picture looks more or less like this. The majority of the sampled non-profit organizations of this study have identified media capture as a negative dimension of the media system they are embedded in. While a few groups are tied to the elites and tend to accept this as how market-driven news media work, most reject this because basically makes them invisible or discredit them in front of more powerful political and economic interests. There are therefore certain inequalities between non-profit organizations that are certainly exacerbated by media capture trends. Despite this, most actors try anyways, which confirms us how desperately they need this publicity despite being a restrictive and even dangerous space. The reason is that the mainstream news media, take for example legacy newspapers, allows them to dialogue with decision makers, potential donors for their causes, and other publics of interest that are not in the social media. Only a few organizations have managed to use their social media and blogs as alternative media where they can actually talk about media capture and try to challenge it. Now, this is an interesting point because it shows us first that not all citizens can afford gaining access to national decision making with the objective of regulating a media system that is captured. But most importantly, it shows us that we need to stretch a bit out the concept of media capture contestation so we can include indirect forms of challenge such as this one. Let me just mention one more thing. Recent research has found that big social media corporations are becoming part of the problem of media capture as well. These corporations are rapidly expanding their potential capability to exert regulatory capture. Some of the organizations I've interviewed are not only reluctant to use news media publicity but also social networking sites exactly for this reason. They think that by using them, they are helping these companies with their profits, and some are also afraid of being under surveillance. This disconnection opens a whole new area of inquiry and could be developed in future research. I finished here. Thank you all for your attention, for watching this video. I hope my presentation was clear and somehow relevant for this panel. If you have any comment or any question, please just post it below and I will be happy to further discuss the topic with you. You can also find me on Twitter or write me an email if you want so. Please enjoy the rest of the conference and thank you again.